one.
Okay. So this is Dr. David Olson. You can tell he's a professional because he came in at exactly noon. He is a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Loyola University Chicago and is a co-director of its Center for Criminal Justice Research, Policy, and Practice. He has published widely in this area, and his counsel and expertise has been sought by professionals in criminal justice at state, county, and city levels. He served as chair of the advisory boards for the Illinois Department of Corrections and the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice. He also served on the Illinois State Commission on Criminal Justice and Sentencing Reform, which produced a comprehensive report in 2016, which has been central to the League's current study, re-examining our position on criminal justice. In this presentation, Dr. Olson will focus on the policies, programs, and operations of the Illinois Department of Corrections with regard to convicted offenders during incarceration and following release. And he's also, I know he worked on the, with Lake County Sheriff's Office, he developed their, all right, I'm having a blank.
Dashboard.
Their dashboard. And he's going to be at their meeting tonight talking about that, right, Dave?
Yep, unveiling the newest version of it, so.
Yes. And that's it. We
right,
really appreciate you coming and talk to us. We know you've talked to a lot of different league groups for this study, and you're busy on so many levels.
Well, I like talking, as you'll see, but I even enjoy more talking to people that are interested in the subject area and looking to try to make improvements and do it objectively and to rely on research and empirical information. So I appreciate you all inviting me. I've got some slides. I'm going to kind of go through these. Some of what I want to do is provide you with a little bit of context to understand how people end up in prison, what they look like, what their characteristics are, and then what happens when they get out. So as was mentioned, I'm on the Illinois Department of Corrections Advisory Board. I've been in that position, including being chair of that board for, I want to say it's probably close to 10 to 15 years. But I've worked in the field of criminal justice, including policy research and policy evaluation for a little bit over 30 years. So what I'm going to present today is intended to give you some information to help you put some of the policy things you're thinking about into context. And I'm also going to hopefully leave enough time at the end to make sure I answer questions that people have, either to come up from this presentation or things that I didn't cover that you want to make sure that I do address. So the last caveat is everything I'm saying here is on, in my position as a faculty member at Loyola who does research. This isn't official policy of the Illinois Department of Corrections or the state of Illinois, although I say this stuff to all of them all the time. So it's nothing secret. So can everybody see the slides okay on the screen? Or someone just give me a thumb up.
Yes, I can see them. I assume everybody else can.
Okay, all right, great. So what I want to talk a little bit about is giving you some information so you understand how people end up in prison, how they get released from prison. That requires a little bit of discussion about the structure of Illinois' sentencing scheme. Show you some information that gives you a sense of what the trends and patterns have been, because what we're seeing today is very different than what we saw 20 years ago, and that's very different from what we saw 40 years ago. And I think it's important to understand kind of where we've been, but also where we are, because I frequently hear people talk about patterns of prison use, and the reference period is 10 or 20 years ago. And it's important to recognize that things have changed a lot since then. I'll talk about who ends up in prison, how long they stay there, and then at the end, I'll talk about some of the areas and opportunities for reform, including some of the questions that I think you guys have been discussing or debating. So to get into it, the first thing I want to make sure everybody has in terms of context is to understand what crime looks like in Illinois. One of the things that we oftentimes get influenced by, or what drives policy, is what is our perception of what crime looks like. So when we look at crimes that get reported to the police in Illinois, very few of those crimes, less than 1% of the crimes that get reported to the police in Illinois is the crime of murder. The next least frequent crime is criminal sexual assault, followed by robbery, followed by aggravated assault. So these crimes comprise what we call the 4 violent index offenses. And as you can see here, these 4 violent crimes account for less than 20% of the crime that occurs in Illinois. When we start looking at property crimes like burglary, theft, and motor vehicle theft, that's where we see the majority of crimes that occur. And the reason why I provide this context is if you're a regular consumer of the news, you are likely only going to ever be exposed to murders. That's the crime that tends to be covered by the media. That's what we see on the TV news. In some instances, we'll hear about rapes that occur, but rarely do we ever hear about these other crimes, which constitute the majority of crimes that the justice system has to respond to. And so I bring that up because a lot of the policies we developed in the 1980s and early 1990s that have gotten us to the situation we are today with respect to incarceration was driven by our concerns over murder or other very specific violent crimes. The other thing to put into some context is information about what we've done in terms of our response to violations of drug laws in Illinois. So in Illinois, arrests for marijuana offenses, you can see the line here, started to increase a lot in the early 1990s. And arrests for marijuana law violations peaked around 2011 at around 60,000. Since then, it's dropped dramatically, in large part to changes in Illinois law. So before marijuana was legalized for recreational use this year, in 2017, there were some changes to Illinois law that decriminalized the possession of small amounts of marijuana, meaning that it was no longer a violation of state law, but it could still be a violation of a municipal ordinance. The one thing that's important to understand about marijuana laws is a lot of people assume that the change to our marijuana laws would have a profound impact on our prison system. The important thing about our marijuana laws is historically, even when marijuana was not legalized, the possession of marijuana was a misdemeanor offense, meaning that if you were caught in possession of marijuana and convicted, you could not be sentenced to prison, given how our state sentencing structure works. More importantly, from the standpoint of prison populations, was the change we saw in arrest patterns for violations of what's called Illinois' Controlled Substances Act. This set of laws is what governs the illegal possession or sale of pretty much all drugs other than marijuana. And what you see in this graph is, starting in 1988, there was a dramatic shift in enforcement strategies around drug law violations. This is what many people refer to as the war on drugs. This was an initiative under President Reagan, where the federal government provided financial resources to state and local units of government to specifically focus on the enforcement of drug laws that didn't include marijuana. Marijuana was never really the focus of the war on drugs. It primarily was focused on cocaine heroin, and then later methamphetamine. And so you see an enormous increase as a result of this shift in policing priorities, where the number of drug arrests went from about 10,000 a year for Controlled Substance Act offenses, from about 10,000 a year, and it peaked in 2001, where it was close to 60,000. Importantly, during this period of time, when the arrests for these offenses increased so much, evidence indicates that the use of these drugs had actually been going down. And the use of these drugs had actually been going down since the 1970s. So it really did reflect a change in police focus and priority. And then starting in the 2000s, we started to see a number of agencies, including the Chicago Police Department, change its approach to drug enforcement, and that explains the drop that we've seen. All right. So getting into sentencing a little bit, I want to just give you a sense of what the trends look like in terms of felony cases that enter the courts. So in Illinois, felony offenses are the ones that are of most concern. Generally, they're considered to be the more serious crimes, but they're also the ones that do carry the possibility of a prison sentence if someone's convicted of the offense. These are going to be driven by how much crime there is, how many arrests that the police make, but also the priorities of the locally elected state's attorneys in each county as to which specific types of crimes and cases they want to invest their resources in prosecuting. That'll also affect the number of cases filed. So, and then we'll talk a little bit about the sentencing structure and how that affects the correctional population. So when we look at the felony cases filed in Illinois courts, so these are the cases entering the court system, you can see here that during the 1980s through the 1990s, there was an enormous increase in the number of felony cases going into the court system. This increase is caused by a couple factors. One is that during the 1980s and early 1990s, there was an increase in crime. There were more crimes occurring in the state. In addition to more crimes occurring, it was also this period where there was an increased focus and emphasis on drug enforcement. And again, we saw earlier that the arrests for the non-marijuana offenses, which are all felonies, dramatically increased. So that's why we saw such a large increase in felony cases entering the system, it was more crime, but also an increased emphasis on enforcement of drug laws. What we've seen in recent years is the reversal of that trend. Right? So since the early 2000s, now we're seeing fewer felony cases entering the courts. In part, this is because there is less crime. We've seen a decrease in crime in Illinois pretty consistently since the mid-1990s. When I present that, I oftentimes get reactions of, "Are you kidding me?" Because it sure doesn't seem like crime is down. And if you watch the news regularly, you wouldn't know that crime was down because they're always going to cover crime stories, particularly homicides. But the amount of crime in Illinois has gone down dramatically since the 1990s, except for a few years where we have seen increases in very specific types of crimes in very specific communities. Currently, we're seeing an increase in homicides in Chicago, and that's highly concentrated in specific communities. So when I say crime is down, I'm talking about crime overall and crime in general. And I'm also talking about the general trend, not the fact that from year to year we may see an increase or a decrease. Right. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about Illinois sentencing structure, so that you can understand how our laws are set up and how sentencing takes place. So the first thing that's important to understand is that in Illinois, we classify our crimes as felonies or misdemeanors. And then within felony and misdemeanor crime categories, we have specific classes of felonies and misdemeanors. How a crime is legally classified as a felony or a misdemeanor, and then within that category, what class of offense it is determined by Illinois' General Assembly. So we have to understand that how we classify our crimes legally is determined by our legislature. They're the ones that decide, for example, that if you possess any amount of cocaine, that is a felony level offense. They're also the ones that determine if you drive under the influence of alcohol, that is a misdemeanor offense. Right? So they're the ones that decide how seriously our crimes get classified. There's opportunities for them to change that. So if they want to make a particular crime more severe from a legal classification, they can move it from a misdemeanor to a felony, for example. They can also determine that the way that we've got our crimes classified perhaps are inappropriate, and perhaps we should take some felonies and make them misdemeanors. The important thing is ultimately that's up to the General Assembly to decide. That's a legislative decision. The other thing in Illinois that's important to understand is with our sentencing structure, we have in place what's called a determinate sentencing scheme. Determinate sentencing means that when a judge imposes a sentence, that sentence is served by the individual minus any credits they may get for their sentence. But once they've served their sentence, minus any credits that they might receive, they have to be released from custody. Previously, Illinois operated under what's called an indeterminate sentencing structure. Under indeterminate sentencing, what a judge would do is they would impose a range of time that an individual would have to serve. For example, they could sentence someone to prison for 10 to 20 years. When they would be released would be determined through the discretion of a parole board. In other words, they could serve 10 years, and then the parole board could say, okay, we're satisfied that you've been appropriately punished and that you've rehabilitated yourself, and we are going to allow you to be released. Or they could exercise their discretion to not release you and keep you in prison. But once you reach the maximum of that range, the 20 years that the judge said is the maximum, then you have to be released from prison. In the 1980s, indeterminate sentencing fell out of favor, not only in Illinois, but in a number of other states in the country. And it was really a perfect example of how it was a sentencing structure that wasn't seen as beneficial by either liberals or conservatives. People that were more conservative did not like indeterminate sentencing because they felt as though parole boards would be too lenient and letting people out of prison too easily. More liberal people were concerned that parole boards were too punitive and that they weren't releasing people who were rehabilitated and keeping them in prison longer than they should have. The important thing about indeterminate sentencing also is it's a sentencing structure that's generally used when we have rehabilitation as the focus of our sentencing. The idea being that once you have participated in rehabilitative programming, or once you've convinced the parole board that you have been rehabilitated, that they would exercise their discretion to release you. In the 1970s, the idea of rehabilitation being a goal also fell out of favor, in part because it was seen as ineffective. There was also concern that prisons were not providing access to rehabilitative programs. In other words, they were setting inmates up for a situation where they could not be released from prison because they couldn't show that they'd been rehabilitated because the rehabilitative programs weren't being offered. So in 1978, Illinois switched to determinate sentencing, which is the sentencing structure that we currently operate under. Under Illinois sentencing structure, when it was originally created this way in 1978, there were two specific classes of crimes that required a prison sentence. That was first-degree murder and what were called Class X felonies. If you were convicted of murder or a Class X felony, the judge had no discretion. They had to sentence you to prison. But for every other felony, you could get a probation sentence. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's also some changes that we saw in Illinois law that dictate what portion of the sentence that the judge imposes has to be served. So I'll touch on this a little bit later because it gets into some very specific types of crimes in terms of controlling that. So generally, most crimes that people are arrested for and charged with and convicted of are eligible for probation, meaning they could receive a sentence of supervision in the community rather than a sentence of incarceration. Research that colleagues and I have done looking at what determines who goes to prison in Illinois have found that the strongest predictors of who gets a sentence to prison is what is the felony class of the crime that they were convicted of. In other words, statutorily, how serious was the crime? And also, what's the extent and nature of their criminal history? Do they have prior convictions? Have they previously been in prison? In addition to those things, there's also other factors that influence sentencing. Things like people's age or the county where they're convicted can play a role. Importantly, in Illinois, decisions about sentencing are a local decision. They're driven primarily by locally elected prosecutors and judges. So we do see variation in Illinois from county to county in who gets probation versus prison. To give you a little bit of a visual on Illinois sentencing structure, just so you can kind of see how it works. So this is essentially how Illinois sentencing structure is laid out. So again, the Illinois legislature decides how a crime will be classified. Will it be a felony or misdemeanor? And if it's going to be a felony, is it going to be a class 4 felony, which is the least serious felony, or is it going to be a class 1 felony, or is it going to be a class X felony? So the way that the sentencing works is, for example, if you are convicted of first-degree murder, right, the judge has to impose a prison sentence because probation is not allowed. And the law dictates that the judge has to pick a sentence somewhere between 20 years and 60 years. For the case of first-degree murder, they can also go above the 60 years when there are specific elements of the crime present, including they can impose sentences of up to natural life. In addition to the prison sentence, the state statute also dictates how long the person will be supervised once they get out of prison on mandatory supervised release. And essentially, it corresponds to the felony class of the crime that they're convicted of. At the other end of the continuum for felonies, we have class 4 felonies. Class 4 felonies are eligible for probation. So if you are placed on probation, the judge can give you a probation sentence of up to 2.5 years. Or if the judge decides to sentence you to prison, he can pick a sentence somewhere between 1 and 3 years. And that would be followed by 1 year of mandatory supervised release or parole supervision in the community. The important thing about the length of mandatory supervised release is this structure was created in 1978. We know a lot more about human behavior and what's effective 40 years later, but we still operate under the same structure. How long you're supervised on mandatory supervised release is dictated solely by the felony class of the crime you're convicted of. So if you go to prison for a class X felony or murder, you get 3 years of supervision. If you go to prison for a class 3 or 4 felony, you get 1 year of supervision. Importantly, the length of your mandatory supervised release has nothing to do with the risk that you pose for public safety. It has nothing to do with the needs you may have upon release from prison. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. All right, so in terms of sentencing in Illinois, when we look at what percent of people get probation, of those convicted of murder and class X felonies, nobody gets probation because that's not an allowable sentence. For the people that get convicted of a class 1 felony, about 47% get probation. And you can see as you move through the felony classes and go from the more serious felony classes to the least serious, you see the percent getting probation increase. Overall, last year, about 2/3 of people convicted of a felony in Illinois received a sentence of probation. When we look at things over time in Illinois, we see some fairly dramatic changes in recent years, but also some gradual changes in the years previously. So what this is showing you is over the last 40 years, what percent of people convicted of a felony got prison and what percent got probation. And so what you can see here is from the 1980s to the mid 2000s, we saw an increase in the percent of convicted felons going to prison. It moved 10 percentage points from around 40% of all felons going to prison to about 50%. Just this change in the likelihood of going to prison equates to almost 6,000 more sentences to prison, just because the courts got more punitive, just because the likelihood of convicted felons going to prison increased. What we've seen in recent years is the opposite trend, right? We've seen a drop in the likelihood that convicted felons would be sentenced to prison, going from around 50% in 2010 to about 38%. In other words, a 12 percentage point drop, right? That equates to about 5,500 fewer sentences to prison, just because the courts have changed their sentencing practices. They're less inclined to use prison than they were in previous years. So what all of this collectively has done is it's increased the number of people under the custody of the criminal justice system for a felony in Illinois. You see that during the 1990s, it essentially doubled from around 60,000 people under the supervision of the system to over 120,000. And then in recent years, we've seen a decrease of about 14% in the sheer number of people under the custody of the criminal justice system. At year end in 2019, this gives you a sense of what jurisdiction are people under the custody of the criminal justice system for a felony being supervised by. So you see here that about 45% of all the people at the end of 2019 that were under the supervision of the justice system for a felony were on supervision in the community under probation. And in Illinois, probation is a local function. It's carried out by county probation departments, and it's under the judicial branch of government. About 1/3 of people are in prison, meaning they're behind bars, located in prisons throughout the state. And about 20% are on supervision in the community, but under mandatory supervised release. These are individuals that are under, in quote, parole supervision in the community. This function is the responsibility of the state government under the executive branch. So this is part of the Illinois Department of Corrections, is supervision in the community for those on mandatory supervised release. So one way you can look at this is more than half of all of the people that are currently under the custody of the criminal justice system in Illinois for a felony are the responsibility of the Illinois Department of Corrections, either from the standpoint of housing them in prisons or supervising them in the community. Now, in terms of criminal justice reform or efforts to reduce prison populations, it's important to understand a couple fairly basic elements about correctional populations. Essentially, what influences how many people are in prison is a function of two factors. It's how many people are admitted to prison and how long do they stay in prison. And so efforts at reducing the size of the prison population generally focuses on either how do we reduce admissions to prison from courts, or how do we reduce the length of stay in prison, or how do we reduce recidivism or the return to criminal behavior of those released from prison so they don't cycle back and start this process over again. And so I want to talk a little bit about just the trends in Illinois' prison admissions and exits and population to give you a sense of what it looks like historically. This gives you a sense of what Illinois' prison population looks like over the last 50 years. So we had a prison population that was below 10,000 for much of the 1970s. And then we began to see it increase, reaching its peak of almost 50,000 inmates around 2014. When we look at admissions to prison, it follows a somewhat similar pattern, but you can see that admissions to prison started to drop fairly dramatically around 2008, 2009. But the prison population itself didn't drop as dramatically as quickly. And part of that is because the numbers of people in prison that have to stay for long periods of time doesn't necessarily change with the admissions. Some of the things that drove this included the war on drugs that we talked about, with the increased arrests for drug law violations. We also saw record levels of violent crime in Illinois in the late 1980s and early 1990s that not only led to more arrests for serious violent crimes, but a lot of changes to our sentencing structures and practices because of this concern for violence. One of those was the implementation of what's called truth in sentencing in Illinois. Truth in sentencing was implemented in 1998. The most important thing about truth in sentencing is what it required is that those people who go to prison for very specific violent crimes are required to serve either 100% of the sentence the judge imposes or 85% of the sentence. In other words, they're not able to earn time off their sentence for good behavior, or they're not able to earn time off their sentence because of participation in rehabilitative programs. And I'll touch on that a bit later. We reached the peak in the war on drugs in the year 2000. In 2009, we had a slight change to our awarding of sentencing credits to inmates that caused an increase in the prison population. And then in 2015, a Blue Ribbon Commission was formed by the former governor, Governor Rauner, that sought to come up with recommendations on how to safely reduce the prison population through different reform efforts. The goal of that commission was to reduce the prison population by 25% by the year 2025. Between that commission's formation and the end of last year, Illinois' prison population had fallen 21%. I'm not talking a lot about the year 2000 yet, because the jury's still out as to what things are going to look like. There have been a lot of changes with sentencing, including the suspension of sentencing and the suspension of admissions to prison because of COVID. So there's a fairly large drop in the prison population in 2020 is partly driven by that, and likely will rebound to some degree once sentencing practices begin. Right. So getting into understanding a little bit about why the prison population grew, a fair amount of that is just because there were more cases entering the courts. There were more felony cases being processed. We also saw an increase in the likelihood that people would be sentenced to prison. That explains about 15% of the growth that we saw. But almost half of the growth in the prison population is because of longer lengths of stay. People are just staying in prison longer because of longer sentences, because of truth in sentencing, and because of some restrictions in the awarding of sentencing credits that would allow people to get out of prison sooner. Right. I'm going to skip over a couple things because I want to get to towards the end and have some questions, or have an opportunity for some questions. So one thing we've seen in the last decade or two in Illinois is we've seen fewer admissions to prison. We've seen some drop in the prison population. We've also seen a change in what the composition of the prison population looks like. If you look at who was in prison in the year 2000, you see that about half of the people in prison were there for a nonviolent crime. They were there serving a sentence for a drug law violation or for a property crime. In the year 2000, not only do we have fewer people in prison, but we also now see a different composition of who's in prison. At the end of the state's fiscal year 2020, which was June 30th of this year, only about a quarter of the people in prison were there serving a sentence for a nonviolent crime. You see here what portion of the people in prison are currently serving a sentence for first-degree murder. But you also see some increases in the number of people in prison who were convicted of illegal gun possession. I mean, they illegally possessed a gun, they didn't have the appropriate license to have a gun, or they were barred from legally owning a gun. When we look at people coming out of prison and the number of people on mandatory supervised release, we see a trend that's fairly consistent with admissions and exits. Everybody who's released from prison after they complete their prison sentence, as I said before, is subject to a period of mandatory supervised release. At the peak, we had around 35,000 people in Illinois under mandatory supervised release. That was also the peak year with respect to admissions and exits from prison. At the end of last year, we had right around 25,000 people being supervised in the community on mandatory supervised release. The last two things I want to touch on is recidivism of those who are released from prison. So there's a couple different ways that recidivism is measured and defined. One definition that's used by the Illinois Department of Corrections is whether or not someone is returned to prison within 3 years. In other words, they did something during the course of their supervision that warranted them being returned to prison. You can see that in the year 2000, we were at the peak of around 55% of people released from prison were back in prison within 3 years. In 2017, that cohort of people who were released and then tracked for 3 years, about 40% were returned to prison within 3 years. So that's an indication of an improvement. It could be because of enhanced rehabilitative programming in prison, but it also likely reflects some changes in parole policy in Illinois. Another way to look at recidivism is, do people get arrested once they get out of prison? And if they get arrested, what do they get arrested for? The important thing with this graph is it's very similar to the slide that I started the presentation out with. Out of all those released from prison, the majority do not get arrested for a new violent crime. In fact, almost 40% of the people released from prison did not get arrested for any crime, right? About 40% were arrested for a crime that didn't involve violence. And then the remaining 20% were arrested for a crime of violence. Importantly, about half of those offenses where there was an arrest for a violent crime involved the offense of domestic violence. And this gets to some degree at the need for rehabilitative programming within the Department of Corrections, which I'll touch on briefly now and that we can talk about once I'm finished. So I looked over some of the questions that you guys have been wrestling with and thinking about. So I want to give you a couple things to think about, and then we can have some conversation. First thing to keep in mind is we have to understand, or at least recognize, what is the purpose of a prison sentence? What do we want to achieve with sending someone to prison? Generally, there's 4 goals that are articulated that we seek to achieve when we impose a sentence. One is just to punish someone, essentially retribution. You did wrong, so we are going to punish you for that. Another goal is incapacitation. We want to physically restrain you from interacting with members of the free community. The third goal is deterrence, that we are hoping to deter you from committing these behaviors again out of fear of punishment, or we want to create fear in other people to prevent them from considering commission of crime themselves. The last goal is rehabilitation, right? That our goal is that when you get out of prison, the needs that you had that led you to commit crime have been addressed, right? Generally speaking, what we have done in Illinois and most states over the last 40 years is very effectively accomplish the first of those two goals. Going to prison as a punishment, and going to prison physically restrains you from being free. Those we're effective at, and those we've done very well. Research on whether or not prison is a deterrent has found that there is a very small effect of prison as a deterrent, that it's not as strong as most people assume. And then lastly, we have done a very poor job of rehabilitation. And part of the reason why we've done a poor job of rehabilitation is, for the most part, that has not been what we have asked prisons to do. That's not what society has articulated their desire for prisons to do. That's not what our policies reflect. And so what we have to recognize is that if someone comes out of prison and commits a new crime, we shouldn't necessarily blame prisons for that, because we didn't ask prisons to rehabilitate. We asked prisons to punish. And prisons do that well. But punishment does not deter criminal behavior. Punishment does not change the fact that you may have a substance use disorder, or that you have other needs that drive your criminal behavior. We'll talk a little bit about sentences for murder in a second. I want to cover a couple other things before we get into that. And that has to do with providing and incentivizing what I call real rehabilitation. So one of the recognitions that we have as a field is we should be relying on evidence-based programs to provide therapeutic interventions to those involved in crime. Evidence-based programs mean that there is empirical evidence, there's research that supports the efficacy and effectiveness of this intervention. Historically, we have tried lots of, in quote, treatment programs in prisons that had no evidence that they worked. They felt good. Intuitively, we thought they would have worked, but in reality, they didn't. One of the principles that we need to recognize, and that's being more and more widely adopted in our field, is what's called the risk-need responsivity principle. The risk-need responsivity principle states that we should focus our limited treatment resources on those who have the highest risk. In many ways, we have done the complete opposite of that as a field. We tend to focus our rehabilitative efforts on those that are easiest to work with, that are most compliant, but they're also the ones that need the treatment the least. We tend to not provide treatment to the high-risk offenders because we don't feel as though they deserve it, right? So we withhold treatment from those who are the highest risk. The need principle is that we should focus the treatment on what drives criminal behavior, not the needs they may have that are genuine needs but aren't connected to their involvement in crime, right? So changing people's cognition or how they think about their behavior is an example of a criminogenic need that can be addressed through therapeutic interventions. Getting a good paying job, while it may be a need, it likely does not drive a lot of the criminal behavior, right? The other thing that we have to recognize is that for the population that's in prison, we need to incentivize them to participate in rehabilitative programming. They tend to not have a lot of trust of government. They don't tend to have a lot of trust of the justice system. We need to incentivize them to want to access and participate in treatment. And one of the policy recommendations that the Governor's Commission came up with to do that is to expand eligibility for what's called earned program sentence credit. What this does is if an inmate participates in a therapeutic intervention, they get additional time off their sentence for their active participation in that. The research that we have done has found that when you offer that incentive, individuals are more likely to enter treatment. They're more likely to stay in treatment until the end. And the completion of that treatment actually reduces their likelihood of recidivism, meaning they don't go out of, they're not released from prison and commit more crime. The last thing to consider is mandatory supervised release. And that's the period of time after people get out of prison. How long should they be supervised? What should the conditions be? And what really is the purpose of mandatory supervised release? And so in terms of the length of mandatory supervised release, one of the recommendations of the Governor's Commission is we should do away with the statutorily mandated lengths of mandatory supervised release that I mentioned earlier are dictated by the felony class of the crime that someone went to prison for. Rather, the length of time should be based on their risk level and their needs. But it shouldn't be more than 18 months, because after 18 months, we're really not in a position to provide any more effective intervention. Right? The last thing I want to just mention, and then we can have some discussion, I'm happy to answer some questions, is the question about what do we do with that most serious offense of first-degree murder. Right? As I said before, 1 in 5 people in prison right now in Illinois is serving a sentence for first-degree murder. Right? First-degree murder is an offense that we can all agree is the most serious offense that can be committed. What we have to wrestle with is what is the appropriate response to that offense. In Illinois, it's always been required that if you commit first-degree murder, you have to be sentenced to prison. Right? What we have done over the years, though, is we've changed how long we want you to be in prison. Right? We have to recognize that most people who are in prison for murder committed this offense before their 25th birthday, before they were fully developed cognitively. There's a growing body of science, and you all, I think, mentioned it in some of your working notes, this idea of emerging adults, that while legally an adult, cognitively, most people don't have adult thinking patterns until they're 25. Right? They're impulsive. They don't think about the consequences of their behavior, and that puts them in risky situations. Right? So most of those in prison for murder were younger than 25 when they committed their offense. Currently, the average age of those in prison for murder is around 45 years, and most of them will be in prison past their 60th birthday. One of the things that we've seen change in Illinois because of truth in sentencing is how long someone will serve in prison for the offense of murder. In the 1970s, the average amount of time a murderer spent in prison was around 10 years, which currently is about what the average length of time someone serves in prison for murder in other developed countries. In the 1990s, that had gone up to an average of around 20 years. Right now, the average length of time someone will serve in prison for murder is around 45 years. So you can see that we've dramatically increased how long people are going to serve in prison for this offense. It's going to keep them in prison until they're much older than had been the case historically, which has implications for medical care. The other thing that we have to recognize is after a certain point, the risk to public safety is low. And all we're really doing by keeping people in prison for really long periods of time is ensuring punishment, right? We spend a lot of money on punishment, right? And that is one of the goals of sentencing. What we have to ask ourselves is, at what point is spending money on more punishment too much money? And one way to think about that is we spend a lot on punishment. Do we spend a lot to support the family members of victims? And it was really one of the things that became clear in the Governor's Commission when we heard public testimony, is hearing from the survivors of homicide victims and their concerns about how very little was provided to them in terms of services and support and counseling and those kinds of things. There's an assumption that all victims want long prison sentences, but after a certain point, we also have to ask, how much do we owe the victims in terms of the need to provide them with some support and services? And at what point is the cost of incarceration not worth it from a financial standpoint? So I'll stop there. And as I promised, I talk a lot and hopefully talk quickly. But I want to now open it up for questions that you may have. If there's things that I said that weren't clear that you'd like clarification on, I'm happy to answer that. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen just so that I can better see
Okay,
people and hands. So
that's well, how we're going to work it. We have two of our committee members who are working on this particular question. One is Kelly McShane, and I just made her a co-host. And I'm looking on my screen for Carol Cohn. There it is. Thanks for holding your hand up, Carol. And they will read to you questions from the chat box from the participants. So I see that there are a couple of questions there. And Kelly, you can unmute yourself and do the first one.
Dr. Olson, the first question is, what is the cost of incarceration in the Department of Corrections right now?
Right, I think right now it's around $35,000 a year per inmate. For older inmates, the general rule of thumb is it's usually about twice as expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about older inmates that might have medical issues, that are infirm, kind of think about it equivalent to the cost of a nursing home.
Yes.
Within a prison. So not only do you have the cost of operating a prison, but you then also have the cost of operating a nursing home within that prison. And almost all of the money that's spent towards the inmates, towards that $35,000, is the cost of security officers to monitor their behavior 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So a lot of people look at that cost and say, well, maybe we shouldn't be giving them such great services and opportunities for rehabilitation. That's not what most of the money goes for. There's very little of that money spent on therapeutic interventions or those kinds of things. It's almost all focused on security, because that's historically been the primary concern, is security.
Can you put any numbers with the rehabilitative services? What is the average spent per inmate on those services?
That one I don't have. I'd say that it's very small, in part because, at least what I think of as therapeutic interventions is treatment programs that are focused on reducing involvement in crime. So things like substance abuse treatment or cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm not counting things like medical care, which is something that every inmate has to have. Some research that we did a few years ago found that about 15% of those who need drug treatment are able to get it while they're in prison. So that at least gives you some sense of how many resources are allocated towards rehabilitation. It's very small. Right?
Yeah.
If you could make a single recommendation regarding the current practices at the IDOC, what would it be?
Keep moving in the direction you're moving. So that they are trying to improve things. Everybody I've met with that says, what should we do to improve the system? I point to the Governor's Commission report that came out in 2016. When the new governor's administration came in and they asked me, what are your ideas? I said, look at that document. It was a bipartisan commission. All the recommendations were supported by the majority of members. All those things make sense. Work on those. And they're trying to do that. The challenge, like I said, for 40 years, the focus and priority has been punishment. Where we put prisons, how we staff prisons, has been based on that principle. Now we want to try to change it. And we're essentially stuck with where the prisons are located. They're located in rural communities where the ability to attract qualified therapeutic staff is challenging. Most of the staff are correctional officers, and they can't easily be fired. And the prisons were primarily designed to incarcerate. They weren't designed to have space and capacity to provide treatment programming. So they are moving in the right direction, but it's one of those difficult ships to turn. It requires a change to the culture and the priority, but there's currently movement towards that, where they're trying to now increase treatment services. They're trying to improve what's provided to inmates upon release, those kinds of things.
Just a follow-up to that, one of our members wants to know what reform initiatives in particular are most important to reduce incarceration in the first place.
I think it's two things. One is to get the public to understand, which then hopefully translates to getting the practitioners to understand that using prison, while it's really effective at punishing, it does not advance our goals with respect to improving public safety. It feels good to many to punish, but in the end, we don't necessarily get safer communities. Research we've done in places like Rockford found that if you put someone on probation or prison, all things being equal, people on probation have lower recidivism rates, right? So if you want public safety, if that's really your goal, then don't rely on prison. Granted, there are crimes, and I'm not an abolitionist with respect to prisons. There are crimes that people need to be punished for. And there are people who are too dangerous to treat in the community. And so prison is an appropriate place for them for punishment. It may also be the best place for rehabilitation. But at some point, we have to recognize that the punishment's over and the rehabilitation's worked, and it's now time to release people. So you see that in a lot of jurisdictions, that prosecutors have changed their approaches. In quote, progressive prosecutors are being elected across the country that are saying, I'm not here just to send people to prison. I'm here to make my community safer. And if that means I'm putting someone in the community and getting them the services they need, that's what I'm here to do. And you see that in a lot of places.
There's another question here about what percentage of inmates go to school or make use of the library or get a degree, advance their education?
I don't know the numbers offhand. I'll say that educational programming is one of the more widespread things that they've got in most institutions. The important thing to understand, though, is what drives people's criminal behavior. And while education is good, most people are not in prison because they don't have a good education. Most people are in prison because of how they think about their behavior and how they think about criminal behavior and what's influenced that. So giving them an education is wonderful. It's something that we should pursue. That alone is not what changes crime. It's changing people's social cognition and how they think about their behavior. And opportunity. The other challenge is, you can give someone a college degree in prison. When they get out, they're still a convicted felon, and there's still a stigma to that society has to overcome.
Are the data that the statistics you gave based on readily available data, and are they reliable?
They're reliable. How readily available they are depends on how much you like working with numbers. Pretty much everything I presented here in theory is available somewhere publicly. It takes a lot of digging, it takes a lot of analysis, it takes a lot of research to produce it. So it's out there. It's one of those where you really have to understand what you're looking for and how to analyze it to divine, in quote, truth from it. The prison system does a really good job at counting how many people are there. That we have no questions about. Whether or not a program is effective or reduces recidivism, that you should be leery about. You should really look at the source, the rigor with which the research was done, because that's a lot of my job is telling people that program probably doesn't work. Whoever told you it did, maybe they were very charismatic. Maybe they showed you some, in quote, research that showed that it works, but from a research design standpoint, it was poorly done. They weren't comparing apples to apples. They took the easiest people to treat and they compared them to the worst people that you could compare them to get their outcomes. So there's a lot of, I'll call it junk science out there, or research that's used to advance political agendas or to promote particular proprietary programs. You just got to be careful with that kind of stuff.
Dr. Olson, could you tell us what is available to treat mental illness in the system? We know that a large percentage of people that are incarcerated show significant symptoms of mental illness. So what's available to them?
Historically, there'd been very little until the federal courts got involved and entered into a consent decree with the Illinois Department of Corrections. So the short answer is it's improving. Previously, there was very little. Now they're under a federal court order and monitor to ensure that they implement effective, appropriate therapeutic interventions for those with suffering from mental illness. So they've created a new facility down in Joliet called I'm blanking on the name, but it's something treatment unit. So it's essentially a prison where everybody there has severe mental illness and is receiving intensive therapeutic interventions to address that. So it's a significant issue. It's also one to think more broadly about mental health. As you get an older population that's in prison, you're starting to see more things like dementia, Alzheimer's, and things of that nature that, again, historically you wouldn't have seen that often because sentences weren't so long. People weren't aging out in prison like they are now. So.
Do you have any thoughts on the emerging adult classification and how it's used?
It's an interesting issue. It's one where, for those of you who are familiar with the juvenile court kind of idea, it's, we have a juvenile court system to treat juveniles separate from adults because we view their behaviors differently and they shouldn't be subject to the same response. I think what we need to recognize is that emerging adults think differently. They're in the criminal situations they're in now because of a lack of cognitive ability. And so, when we think about people, well, they should have known better before they got in a car with someone who then committed a robbery that escalated to a murder. We have to recognize, and if we all are seriously reflecting, think back to what you were thinking and doing when you were 19 or 20. And if you're like me, you probably did some things that in hindsight, you realize were really stupid and really risky. Unfortunately, if that involves criminal behavior, the consequences you face are potentially very serious, as is the case with felony murder, where you could make a stupid mistake and not because of any action you did, but somebody you were with did, you could face 45 years in prison. You could end up spending the rest of your life in prison for something you did that was very impulsive, where you didn't think through it, and now you're facing those consequences. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to recognize, and that's that at least the research that me and my colleagues have done is it seems as though the courts are actually more punitive with emerging adults. So the younger you are, the more likely you are to be sentenced to prison. What I think we need to do is reflect again on, should we view them as a threat, or should we view them as someone who made a stupid mistake? The other thing I'm kind of reflect on as this emerging adult issues emerge more and more is I look at the professionals in the field and how old they are, and then I look at the population that they're working with. So you have a lot of probation officers or parole officers that are in their 40s and 50s supervising a lot of emerging adults, and I think they look at them and say they're being disrespectful, they won't follow rules, and they're kind of forgetting that, well, keep in mind, they're not 40 and 50 years old like you are. They're 20 years old like you used to be. And when you were 20, you probably didn't listen to authority all the time either. So I think there's a couple ways to do it. One is we just need to make the field aware of how we think about this population. But there have been some efforts legislatively to either create almost like a third tier of a justice system. So we've got a juvenile system, an adult system. Do we need an emerging adult system? I don't like that because it essentially increases the size of government, by a third. I think there are some things that policymakers are also thinking about, and that has to do with things like truth in sentencing and looking at the sentence that was imposed on someone who was an emerging adult and now they're in their 40s. Should we reconsider that? In other words, should we maybe bring back some of the thinking behind indeterminate sentencing, where we look at that case and say, They've been a model inmate. They participated in all these programs. What they did when they were 20 was stupid. Maybe we shouldn't keep them in prison another 20 years. Maybe at 40, we can let them out rather than keeping them in prison till they're 65. So those are some of the things to think about. Just an example, I've got a friend of mine who he went to prison for murder before truth in sentencing was passed. He got out of prison. He got his bachelor's degree. He got his master's degree. He's the CEO of a large social service agency, having a profound positive impact on the community. Had he committed his crime 2 years later, he'd still be in prison right now, and he'd be in prison for another 15 years. In other words, he's doing a lot of good for the community. And had he been sentenced under truth in sentencing, we'd be spending $35,000 a year for him to sit and twiddle his thumbs in prison. So there's got to be some mechanisms where we can identify those who could be released safely so that they can not only reduce the financial burden on the state from the standpoint of prisons, but contribute back to their community.
You talked about some programs that make claims for rehabilitation that don't really hold up under scrutiny. And there was a question about, do you bring that same skepticism to the restorative justice programs in the community that have become more prevalent?
I bring my same skepticism to everything. I approach everything as a social scientist, and I should start out as an objective social scientist who doesn't get involved in politics. I don't play politics. I don't ascribe to political parties. I'm here to do objective research. I think restorative justice is a good idea. It's a good approach. It's something that we should be doing across the board, because really the idea behind restorative justice is we need to restore the harm that was done to the victim or the community. That should always be our goal, right? And then I think contrast that with what our goal has been, and that's let's punish the offender. Let's focus all of our angst and anger on them and impose a really long prison sentence and assume that that's what everybody wants. That may not be what everybody wants. You know, the victim might want the front door that was kicked in repaired. They may want the offender to apologize and explain why they victimized them. So I think it's a good idea. What I get concerned about is I heard once that there was a restorative justice program and the recidivism rate was 0, right? My rule of thumb is if you ever hear of a recidivism rate being 0, either they define recidivism differently than everybody else, or they were working with a population that was so low risk that they weren't going to offend anyway. They weren't going to reoffend anyway. So that's my only caveat. If the results sound too good to be true, they're too good to be true. What we found and what the science has found is if you can reduce recidivism from 50% to 30%, you are really doing a great job. That's a really effective program. That's an evidence-based program that's applying all these principles. If you reduce it to 0%, you've got a weird definition of recidivism, or you're dealing with a population that didn't need it in the first place. So that's my skepticism that I'd hope everybody would have, that there's no silver bullet. This stuff is not easy. You're dealing with human behavior. You can only control so much of their environment and what they're exposed to. So reducing it from 50 to 30%, we should be happy with that. That should be something that we celebrate. The concern I have is oftentimes politically and in the media, we focus on the 30% that's still recidivated and say, well, look, they went through treatment and some of them are still committing crime. Yeah, they are, because we can't address everything through therapeutic interventions. But we reduced it, and people are safer because of it.
Are there organizations advocating for prison reform that an individual could join that you would think does decent work?
Yeah, there's an organization called the John Howard Association, which I'm not sure if anyone's ever heard of it. The John Howard Association is a long established organization that's not part of government, that essentially monitors the conditions in our prisons and makes recommendations to the legislature and the prison system on how to improve the conditions of confinement. They're very effective, and they've been around a long time. They're really focused on the conditions of prisons, the services provided, the policies that guide prisons. There's another project that's relatively recent. I think it's called the Illinois Prison Project. Their focus is on trying to earn the release for individuals who received extremely long sentences. And so it's primarily attorneys who identify cases where they feel as though this case is a strong case for getting a petition or getting clemency from the governor, and they do the legal work to do that. So they've had some successes with women, for example, who've been in prison for 25 years, who were convicted of murdering an abusive partner and were able to get a grant of clemency, or inmates who were subject to some of the more obscure laws but still impose really long sentences. So there are groups like that. I kind of, the John Howard Association is the one that's more focused on policy stuff, but there's a lot of other groups that are there to advocate for women in prison or specific types of inmates with long sentences or things like that.
As you may know, the work of the League is in our criminal justice study has drawn heavily from the Illinois Commission on Reform in Criminal Justice. I'm wondering if you could tell us about where the pushback comes for people that don't agree with the recommended reforms.
Yeah, I think part of it, and that's why I'm happy to do things like this, part of it is educating people that not everyone in prison is there for murder. Even the ones that are there in prison for murder maybe don't need to be in prison forever. So a lot of it is just making sure that people are aware of what reality is. Don't get swayed by smooth talking politicians that would lead you to believe otherwise, because that's really how we got into this situation. And again, it's not political parties. I pointed out Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, that created a lot of the situations that created the problems we're in. But Bill Clinton was also an equal contributor to this with some of the policies that he advanced. So really the important thing is making sure that you're educated. A lot of the pushback comes from people that says, that doesn't make sense. Why should we treat high-risk people? Because intuitively that doesn't sound like it would make sense. And my response is, you realize that high-risk people do get out of prison, right? They are released eventually. Would you rather they have been rehabilitated or just punished? So part of it is just recognizing that intuitively things may not sound right, but going to prison isn't a deterrent for the population that's subject to incarceration. It's nothing they haven't experienced in terms of trauma and harm and things in their everyday life. So it's not necessarily a deterrent. I think a lot of the pushback will come, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because I saw that the governor announced yesterday that part of the strategy for reducing the budget hole is going to be to reduce the number of prisons and close prisons in Illinois. That's where the biggest political pushback will come, is what we've created in Illinois is a system where there are a lot of communities that have relied on a prison for their economic development. It was a policy that we pursued in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that now we are having to think about. The prison population today, I think, is below 30,000. It was 50,000 just 6 or 7 years ago. At a certain point, we will not need as many prisons as we have right now. But closing those will prove to be difficult, which is why we haven't done it. We have not closed a prison in Illinois, I believe, since around 2002, when the Joliet Correctional Center was closed. But we built an addition onto another prison to accommodate it, right? So that's where the biggest political pushback will come, that The labor unions get involved in that. The communities where these prisons are located in will be complaining about it and fighting it. But the analogy that I give is there was a lot of concern over the coal industry in the United States, and we need to prop up the coal industry. And I think that at least my limited understanding of energy policy is coal is an inefficient source of energy, right? We've developed beyond the reliance on coal for energy. We need to think about prisons the same way. Prisons were a policy response to a problem that we established a long time ago, but our understanding of the problem has changed, right? We know better ways to produce energy now. We also know better ways to respond to crime. And so keeping prisons open just for the sake of keeping them open would be the equivalent of let's keep mining coal just because we want to keep mining coal, right? Because we want to provide those jobs. So that's what the challenge will be, is we need to figure out what's the replacement economy. When we close prisons, what do we do for the people that have become reliant on that for generations as a source of employment that provides good benefits and good health care and all those kinds of things. That'll be the difficult thing. But hopefully with that also comes the transformation of what is the purpose of prisons. And maybe this is an opportunity to say, let's start changing how we think about them. Maybe they should be more therapeutic. Maybe they should focus more on some of these kinds of services.
We have one more, well, maybe two. The transgender issue. Do you have any idea of the number of transgender individuals in prison in Illinois, how their assignments are handled, and what the issues are relating to their surviving?
Yeah. I'll say my limit. I'll tell you what my limited knowledge is. It's relatively rare. There are not a lot of inmates that are transgender. The determination as to where they will be housed is based on a combination of medical considerations and safety considerations. So I know I was actually involved in kind of overseeing the discussion of a particular case where the primary concern was, can this inmate produce sperm or semen, right? Is there a risk that this inmate can actually get somebody pregnant? That's one concern. And then what's the risk of victimization that this inmate may face? And so unfortunately, when you have really small numbers of a population, it's difficult to provide good housing opportunities within prison because you can't have an entire facility dedicated to that population because there just aren't enough of them. So I know that there's been a lot of litigation as well in Illinois about what you have to provide to them, because the primary concern oftentimes, again, is security. We've got to make sure that this inmate isn't victimized. What's the best way we can do that? We don't let them out of their cell. So you see a lot of use of segregation, and it sounds as though it's a punitive response, but really the goal is we want to ensure that this inmate is not victimized. And there's limited tools that they have. So that's, I don't know a lot about the policy issue, but there's, again, it's at least a relatively small population in terms of size. It probably creates a lot of challenges though, even though it's a small population.
Okay. That about wraps up what we have here. I'd just like to say that somebody said she just really loves your coal analogy.
I'll give you one other analogy I thought of, and then I won't bore you with too much more. The other way to think about treatment in prison is, I was trying to think of an analogy related to the health things that we're all facing, right? Think about treatment in prison like this. If you had 100 people go to the doctor for every possible medical issue you could envision, cancer, sinus infection, broken foot, go through the list. If the doctor gave every one of them an antibiotic for their treatment, what would we call that? We call that medical malpractice, right?
Yes.
Right. And most of the people would not be cured, right? They'd come back to the doctor with the same issues that they presented with. In other words, they'd recidivate, right? They'd come back to their doctor saying, my foot's still sore, right? I still have cancer. We've done that in corrections for a long time, is we've committed malpractice. We provide the same therapeutic intervention to everybody, regardless of what therapeutic intervention they need, right? And because of that, we see high rates of recidivism, right? What we really need is the approach where we figure out what your individual needs are and we provide you with those specific services. And it's based on a risk assessment, and we have the programs and services available. The other malpractice analogy I can give you to kind of leave you with something to think about is we know what we can do in terms of treatment and therapeutic interventions to reduce crime. We know exactly what works and we know how to deliver it, yet we don't, right? That too is a form of malpractice. In other words, we know what we could do to reduce recidivism and improve public safety. We choose not to do it, right? We choose not to do it because we assume that the punishment should cure the behavior. We assume that everybody getting that antibiotic will be cured of their cancer and their broken foot and everything else that they have. And so it's really challenging us to say, we know what we need to do. Now we just need the political will to do it. We need to say that it's okay to provide treatment and rehabilitation to someone who's in prison for a violent crime, right? Because I would personally prefer that they come out of prison better off when I encounter them on the street or when they're in the store with me or when they move in next to me, right? So it's really changing the way we think about what do we want prisons to do. Fortunately, what we've seen in the last 10 years in Illinois is we are relying on prison less. We are keeping people in the community on probation more. And it's in the community where they have better access to services and they can maintain positive relationships that they have with people in the community.
You're really good with the analogies. Thank you.
Yeah, when I present the same stuff over and over, I got to come up with things to keep me interested and thinking.
Well, is my mute off? I've done.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I wanted to thank Dr. Olson for coming. I want you to know that we have people registered today from leagues from many different areas in Illinois: Northwest Lake County, Elgin, Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, Highland Park, Highwood, Deerfield area, Oak Park River Forest, Rockford, Glenview, Glencoe, McHenry County, Downers Grove, Lisle, Woodridge, McLean County, and Palatine. And we also have Bruce Johnson here today, who was the first speaker that we had in this series. And Bruce, for those who don't know, is the CEO of Nicasa Behavioral Health in Lake County, was 10 years the police chief of Round Lake Park. And I don't know if he has anything particular to ask you. Bruce, did you have anything to say offhand? And Linda, I'm having trouble with my screen. Can you unmute Bruce, please?
Okay, let me find him. Oh, there he is. Okay,
Got it.
Okay.
got it?
That was the best I sounded when I was muted. I was listening intently. I've heard Dave speak many, many times. He's helped us a lot in Lake County, both looking at data and trying to strategize about how we should move forward in Lake County. And the only thing I was just going to mention is just NICASA's experience with the Illinois Department of Corrections. There are some treatment prisons that Illinois has, Sheridan Correctional Center and Southwest Correctional Center, and they do a really wonderful job of substance abuse and some co-occurring treatment while the individuals are in prison, and actually shadow and see how they actually run that treatment prison. And exceptional job. I mean, their programming is evidence-based, very, very much about changing the way those individuals think, and also having them understand their triggers for why they commit crimes. So just thought it was exceptional. But to Dave's point, I know you like analogies, and kind of in this case, it's a little bit of irony. Unfortunately, in the Southwest Correctional Center, which is down in East St. Louis, when you walk out of the prison, unfortunately, the first thing that you're confronted with is maybe one of the largest adult strip clubs with all the things you'd never want somebody to have to deal with directly in front of them. And I thought just how horrible it was to put that there. And to Dave's point, the reason why, you know, prisons are located where they are, you can just shake your head at. But I thought, what a terrible thing to be confronted with when leaving the prison. Just my little thought. But IDOC, I think, has made some exceptional advancements. I started policing in the early 80s, and I was watching the statistics that, you know, Dave had put out when I was a young police officer, and, you know, in the war on drugs and locking people up, and then later in my policing career, when community policing began to be really the push, and there was a lot of federal money to start community policing programs throughout the United States, there was a shift there too. And I think a positive shift that I hope will continue. But Dave, I love listening to you. I could listen to you. I think I'm gonna listen to you again tonight.
Yeah, yeah, for better, for worse. And I had the benefit of spending 7 years at Sheridan and Swick. So I actually evaluated those two prison programs. And that, to Bruce's point, those are the two prisons that are like the crown jewels of the Illinois Department of Corrections in terms of rehabilitation. The problem is they serve about 1,200 people a year, and there's more than 30,000 in the system. So that's the example. We know what to do. We, you know, when that prison was designed, it was designed, let's create a prison that has everything that all the experts say we should have. And we're going to put it there, and we're going to give people that service, and it works. And we evaluated it. We're in the process right now of reevaluating it because the evaluation's 10 years old, and you should continuously evaluate things. But if you're in the Illinois Department of Corrections and you don't go to one of those two prisons, then you're not going to get access to drug treatment, because that's about the only two places you'll go to get it. So there are efforts to create prisons that have some unique services, but their capacity is never going to be enough to serve the broader community. So,
Dave, just to make you smile, I'm also a graduate of Lewis University, and many of those that are incarcerated, Stateville, et cetera, can get their degree from Lewis University, the same degree that I have, which is, I think, great.
Yeah.
Linda, I'll let you close out the program.
Okay. Thank you very much again, Dave, for your presentation. It was great. We had a lot of questions for you, and we've learned a lot, and hope that when we finish this and have a new and improved study to go by, we can start working on some of these problems. And thank you, Bruce, for your input.
And if anybody has any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm happy to talk one-on-one or do presentations for other groups, or answer questions that you might have had that you didn't get answered. So thanks again for having me.
That's terrific. I'm going to stop the recording, and then we have our Lake County meeting, which you're welcome to stay and be part of it, but I'll stop the recording right